Good
Yes,
evening.
okay. Delivered.
Good evening. My name is Lisa Steele. I'm the Artistic Director at VTAPE, where we acknowledge we're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit River, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations, Métis and the Inuit peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. As Yaniya Lee's 8-title video program, Fractured Horizon, A View from the Body, draws to a close, VTAPE is hosting a conversation between her and Andrea Fatona. Yaniya's essay, which is a continuation of her research into Black film and video practices, is entitled Glitch and Figure, Representation and Refusal in the Videos of Buseje Bailey and Ariella. All the works in Fractured Horizon, A View from the Body, will be available for viewing through September 25th this week at 7 p.m. Look for the full program in past events archive on the VTAPE website. And please note, all of these titles are available with closed captioning, so do spread the word. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Yaniya Lee, who is a writer and editor who uses interdisciplinary research to question critical reading practices and reconsider Canadian art histories. The current issue of Canadian Art Magazine, Chroma, which I highly recommend, was co-edited by Lee with Denise Reiner. Yaniya Lee is the 2019-2020 the researcher is present in residence at VTAPE. Yaniya.
Hi, thank you, Lisa. I'm going to switch it up. And yes, Andrea's here. She's going to join us. I've propped up my phone on a thing. I've never done this from home. It feels quite interesting. Public-private collapse. Hi, this is Andrea Fatona, who is, such a huge figure in Black art. She's an independent curator and scholar, and I read your thesis. That was very important to me when I was doing my MA research, and you organized the State of Blackness conference several years ago in Toronto, which was also a really great starting point for a lot of folks thinking about Blackness and the archive and Black arts practices in Canada. Yeah, thanks for joining this talk.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Right. I can hear you. Yes. Okay. So it's really, really exciting to be here in conversation with you about this work. And, it's really interesting to see you and others do the work of bringing the past in terms of our histories of production, particular media production, into conversation with the present. As you know, or maybe you don't know, a little work was done at VTAPE to look at the catalog, and we actually discovered that there's a substantial amount of Black works produced by Black media artists in the catalog at VTAPE, stretching back to the 70s. And so that work, as you know, and many of us within the Black arts community, has not been talked about. It's not been written about in terms of their aesthetic strategies. They've been talked about a lot in terms of the older work, in terms of, again, basically content and identity politics issues. So it's really, really refreshing and exciting to actually see this work, beginning to parse out the kinds of strategies, formal strategies used by Black media artists and Indigenous media artists to actually narrate stories about our humanness. So I just wanted to ask you, what brought you to this work and the inspiration to try to unpack the histories and how they affect our present?
That's a big question. I'll just specifically with this project at VTAPE, Lisa and I had been in conversation, and we were just sort of thinking about what I could do while I was working in the archive and what focus that research would take. our conversation started maybe a year and a half ago, so last summer, not this summer, the summer before. And what was the most fresh in my mind was seeing a group of young researchers and artists call out the arts institution that had invited them to be researchers in residence. So I mentioned it at the beginning of the article that I've written for VTAPE. It was the Images Research Forum, and then within the research forum of young people who were invited to participate to witness all of the festival's events. This group of BIPOC people was very dissatisfied with their experience and with what happened, and they had a lot of very precise criticisms of the festival. And when I heard this, a part of me was like, hell yeah, I understand, of course, always ask for more pushback. It's so amazing that you're articulating everything you're saying. But then the part of me that has been working in institutions for a couple of years now and understands the negotiations between sort of donors and boards and publics and funding, and you're often trying to balance a bunch of things to just make something happen. That part of me was like, well, come on, like we're working so hard to even make this happen. How is it that you can be reacting this way? And so just those two opposite feelings of fully understanding how we constantly be needing to push for more, for a kind of equity and social justice within how we treat people and how we care for people within arts organizations, and then a sort of appreciation for everything that's been done, was the starting point, or the tension that I came into the archive with. Just thinking, how does each generation seem to renew a set of questions that are, you know, activist questions that are pushing for change? How are we doing this every 10 years, every 20 years, every 30 years?
So there's a bit of, I mean, you're pointing out to a bit of a gap in terms of the historical memory being disseminated, being known by younger activists and media artists, younger artists at the moment. So, you know, I just wondered, you know, as someone who's worked in institutions, based on, you know, some of the things you've talked about in the essay, and they're really about structural issues. So I wondered if we could talk about, you know, contextualize the structural issues that, say, a Buseje Bailey, prior to her, someone like a Claire Prieto, Sylvia Hamilton, a number of the founders or the folks who paved the way for what we do today. Wonder if we could just talk a little bit about the structural concerns they were dealing with, the context, right? Because I think the contexts are different. They're somewhat similar at this moment in terms of the circulation and economy of images of the Black body and of Indigenous bodies. So I think that the moments are very different, yet at the same time they're inflected by a particular violent exclusion of Black cultural production. So, you know, in terms of my work, I located that moment, and you located that moment in the 80s and 90s, where there was a big push because we weren't being seen, and at the same time, again, the kind of violence taking place in urban centers, Toronto, Montreal, you know, Albert Johnson, all of that, and much of that was written up in places like Share and Contrast. I believe these were the things people like Buseje and that generation is pushing against. So let's talk maybe a little bit about that moment and what you see in terms of the research you've done as some of the strategies in the work, because I think they were very important strategies for that moment.
Yeah, I mean, you're the expert. I love the work that you've done looking at sort of the effects of multicultural policies in the arts, and how that determined or over-determined what got shown and what got funded, and sort of made some changes in terms of what was represented and how it was represented. So a lot of programs were started in the late 80s, and I think that was fantastic on the one hand, but maybe caused a bit of difficulty. I'm not, an expert. Looking into the archive, what I did find was artists who were working in the late 80s and in the early 90s, I was looking particularly at the early 90s, were interested and working really hard to just have positive representations and positive images of people who looked like them. So queer people, Black people, like femme folks, Indigenous folks, everybody. It was almost in French you say premier degré, but it was just like, I am a person, I am a human, this is an image of me, this is me with my family, this is me with my friends, this is my history. I just need to tell you from, you know, my point of view, who I am and what my experience is. And there was something very, I don't want to say authentic, but like plain and direct about those types of representations that, coming from my perspective in 2020 and having, you know, I've been thinking about art for maybe 5-10 years, not even that long, it's almost jarring because sincere, there was something very sincere about how people were making work and needing, you could tell, just thirsting and being so empowered. It was exhilarating to see the kind of work that was being made in its sincerity, but we don't do things like that anymore, I don't think.
Well, I mean, I think there's something about this kind of desire that we had at the moment, right, with this possibility that in the diversity years we were getting money from councils, you know, based on a lot of very hard work that was done by people like Norbesi Phillip, and you know, the list goes on around really trying to parse out this moment, those moments as moments that we should be thinking about anti-racism. Yet we got, you know, I think we got seduced in a way, given the kinds of funding we were getting, and the ability to make work. There was something that was happening too, which, you know, I think Monica Gagnon and Richard Fung in that book, 13 Conversations, sort of started to unpack by some of those conversations about that moment where we were sort of almost everywhere in a way, yet at the same time, structurally, we were nowhere, right, in terms of those institutions. We were able to produce from our own voices, our understanding of ourselves, but our bodies and our perspectives were never actually inserted within those institutions that we were working with and presenting. You know, in a certain way, I was fortunate in ways of being able to actually develop my own understanding of Black Canadian art and Canadian art in general through actually being in those institutions. And I have to say that, you know, I did learn and I still continue to learn, but the ideas that Buseje puts forward around this is sort of almost being almost in a tenuous position most of the time and not quite being able to take up that space because of the kinds of strictures and ways in which tacit racism would raise its head. So, you know, this notion of bringing back the works of folks like Buseje into public conversation with contemporary works is very, very important because many of these artists who've paved the way, and I'd bring in too in terms of queer artists like Dana Inkster, in terms of trying to create another type of representation that had the body present, right? And a real insistence on our bodies, but not just our bodies. I think about the entire program that you've presented. Maybe we can talk about this really insistence on an interiority, right? I think that's the interesting aspect of that moment, 80s, 90s, right? This real engagement with, I think what, you know, Andrea Davis used the term for this, the livingness of Blackness, right? The interior spaces in which Blackness, it just is, right? So just wondering, you know, in terms of that notion of livingness in the program that you've presented as one aspect, both in the earlier works and also in the more contemporary works. I'm thinking about the entire program. I think it might be interesting, you know, for me to hear a little bit from you about this notion that this term I'm borrowing from Andrea Davis, which I think is a really important one, about presenting us as humans and as ourselves, which is this notion of livingness, the interior spaces that we negotiate and occupy.
I mean, I would start by maybe talking about Ariella Ty's work that I speak of in relation to Buseje Bailey. So I looked at at their practice, and then look at specific works in relation to ones that were made by Bailey in the early and mid 90s. And this livingness, I'm not familiar with that term, but definitely the interior space is what I see Thai negotiating. And so they reuse a lot of popular images of Blackness from American film and television. And in their recomposition of those images, they allow for a multiplicity of being, maybe what you're talking about as livingness, and something that I would think of as sort of the infinite difference that can exist within Blackness. When I think of Blackness, particularly in Canada, there's been different concepts or theories that have helped us think about what that might mean, what it means to be Black in Canada, how we situate ourselves, what that subjectivity might look like. But one way in which it's helpful for me to understand it is an infinite difference, is something more like what Glissant talks about, that there is no single way of being, and that is sort of the thing that joins us. And in selecting some of the artists that I chose, they're focused on that interior space, on sort of a radical individuality, on I am this particular human, and I am allied in my identity to this person and to this place. There's many different ways in which we have social connections, but we're not defined by sort of one thing. And I think a focus on the interiority allows for that humanness to come forth and the identity politics to sort of be fractured and broken a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also a refusal of particular external spaces of violence and anti-Black racism, that we exist in spaces where we actually create what might be maybe provisionally spaces of joy, spaces of exchange. And for me, you know, it really comes out in the works right from the 70s to the present. That insistence on our abilities to create alternate spaces to the barrage that comes is what came for me, you know?
Well, and I connect to what you're saying about that violence and the refusal or avoiding that violence, because I think so much, or I know we experience so much of the representation of violence against Black people. So images of Black death are so prevalent. They always have been. They've been a source of entertainment for a long time in different ways, and they're circulating again. These images are circulating, and they're absolutely horrifying. And so how I'm interested in how visual practitioners contend with those violent images and with that violent representation. I think Black, racialized, different artists are contending with the violence of those representations by avoiding it altogether, by different acts of refusal, and by representing an interiority, or maybe representing those images in different ways that are broken down, less straightforward, and that have multiple entry points for different identities that are plural as opposed to singular, which is what we get boxed into so often.
Exactly, and as you're speaking, you know, it reminds me of Elizabeth Alexander's essay that's probably about, 30 years old, called Can You Be Black and Look at This? I think it's like the beatings of Rodney King. And so I think about that essay in this moment and the work you're doing, and also trying to, and the work we do in terms of parsing out the shifts in aesthetic strategies used by Indigenous and Black artists. So I want to kind of talk about that next with you, you know, in this economy that there's just the visuals are structured and predicated on this anti-Black racism and violence. To talk about this idea that I think you're moving towards in a way, through even thinking about Arielle Thai's work as a particular kind of glitch aesthetics and a particular kind of refusal. To talk about, you know, this, I think for me, I end up in a kind of conundrum around some of the work around a particular kind of representation of Blackness in I see, in a way, the strategy being used. One, trying to move towards something, I think, that is towards more of an abstraction, more of a fractured identity. But I just want to hear from you a little bit more about the strategy in this context, particularly when the image is still being deployed, right? The image that has been read in particular ways, and the image, I'm trying to understand a little bit more around how we can destabilize the image, or whether or not we might have to go to something else as a way to fracture the chauvinism of the image.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, Natalie Hunter-Young has just posted in the answers that Elizabeth Alexander was recently interviewed in the New York Times, but I think of Nat often because she is doing her PhD right now at Ryerson in New York and thinking about images, what she calls, I don't even know if I'm supposed to say this, but she's thinking about the circulation of images of Black death online and what that means for audiences. Who does it benefit? Who does it take away from? Why is that circulating? And in thinking of abstraction and Blackness and representation, I'm also reminded of a text by Aria Dean from several years ago, and she was talking about Black culture online and its circulation and how it is, and we all know this. We know this about Black culture. It gets taken, and then somebody else profits from it, and it's like it runs away before we're even able to hold on to it. But when we hold on to it, it's denigrated, and then when somebody else has it, it's somehow better or different or not the same thing. And so I think a part of a move towards abstraction is a way of avoiding capture. It's sort of recognizing how Blackness circulates and how often the way that it circulates is away from us, that we do not have control of our images. We do not have control of where they flow. We do not have control of how they're presented. Even earlier, you were talking about the work that was done in the early 90s and people were able to make their own work, but then what I was thinking is, one, you've done so much work as a Black woman curator to bring forth artists and work towards presenting them, towards creating the conditions of presentation. But we often, as you mentioned, we don't have control of the means of representation. So it's okay if we can make our own images, but if we don't get to control how they're shown, that's problematic. If we don't get to control how they're framed, that's also problematic. And I think that this move towards abstraction is a way of jamming the system, because we're still playing with visual cultures, we're still working on, creating visual representations, but we're resisting. We're doing it in our own way, and we're doing it in a way that's not immediately legible. I'm saying we like I'm an artist, but I mean, Black artists are,
So, I mean, as you speak, what comes to mind for me is this notion of publics and who we're speaking to and where we're speaking to them. And so, I think about this current moment where the digital becomes the means of dissemination, not just the means of dissemination, but also the source of production, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm really thinking through this idea of refusal in the context of this sort of space in which images proliferate, sound proliferates, sound bites proliferate. Wondering through how and it's a question, how do we then come to find a space of agency in owning these images? I'm really almost at the point where I really believe we have to create our own spaces, even within the digital space. And I think we have to maybe even, as I'm trying to do in a very, hopefully slow way, to think about, is there a space for us that we create within this digital ecology that allows us to own our works, produce our works, and disseminate our works? Not that will foreclose things around appropriation and a reframing of value as a way to take these things out of that space. But it seems to me that that might be the next move as we really try to create space, given the fact that we've seen that structurally. I mean, the Black Lives Matter moment right now is actually saying to us, you know what, we've been in this space for a very long time with knees on our necks in all sorts of ways. Structurally, things haven't changed. So in a way, ideologically, our positions and materially, our positions haven't actually quite shifted into those places where we have any control.
Well, when you're speaking, I'm like, yeah, we need to do it ourselves. Like when I think of her essay and talking about the circulation of Blackness and how, you know, we produce this Black culture online that then gets away from us, and we don't get paid for it. Oftentimes Black folks won't get paid for what turns into culture, and that, you know, makes me think of plantation economies or other times in history wherein Black folks' work was taken away from them and they weren't paid. And then I think, okay, what would it mean for us to own, produce, and disseminate our own work? And I thought of Jay-Z. What was the platform that he made? His online streaming platform. Jay-Z is, you know, he's almost a billionaire. He's a very, very, very rich man. He's a Black man, but he's a rich man. So what do I want Jay-Z to be the one who's allowing me to own and disseminate my work? And that brings me to, like, I guess, but capitalism. So yes, I'm with you. Let's do it. I want to figure out a way for us to make our own spaces, but there's this crux or there's a pain in the side, which is we all have to contend with the structures of capitalism, which are, I think, Tidal. Yes, it's called. He made an online streaming platform called Tidal. I don't know, how does capitalism fit into that? Us wanting to avoid the violence of consumption and create our own spaces, which I think is absolutely possible. But then how do we avoid? Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure that I'm saying that we have to avoid. I mean, I think that there's certain ways, I mean, that we can actually deploy the kind of talents we've got. I mean, I was just reading an article today around someone still saying that there isn't a pool of talented Black people in this country to hold certain positions, right? And I think I have to say this, maybe we, in a certain way, we have to come up with new ways, right? To imagine ways that might take a different path around what it means to create this value, right? And to create our own spaces within that, without falling into the traps necessarily of the kind of capitalist individualistic way. Because for me, again, you know, when you said, oh, so Jay-Z produced this, so should I produce for Jay-Z, right? It sort of symbolized to me right away that it's not about that type of a system anymore if we're going to engage with coming up with new models for producing ourselves. And actually, you know, I have to say that we already have those models in place. It's really how do we value them and see them as perhaps being productive in providing spaces. There's so many Black collectives around now.
Yeah, I think of the Salafi Festival, which I think happened twice in the 90s. Is that possible? It was early 90s and mid 90s. I don't know much about it, but I know that looking at the artifacts in the archive, it looks like it was a huge festival of film and art. I imagine there was music and different public performances that was Black folks from across the country and internationally. There was all sorts of coalitions in that, and that seemed like a space that was for and by sort of Black arts practitioners. And then more in the present, I know that one of the outcomes of your State of Blackness conference was this online forum on Facebook that I go to, you know, every couple of days, that I think is run by Deanna Bowen and maybe Michelle Pearson Clark. And it's like a crowdsource almost. I mean, they post a lot on it, but everybody does. And we all share as sort of a Black arts community in Canada. And I can go there and just, it's a kind of forum as you're talking about. It is within Facebook, but nonetheless, you know, we can share there.
And I guess, you know, really, I'm kind of proposing too, maybe as part of the solution, that maybe we can, if we desire, if this is part of the desire, we could create our own Facebook, right? With a different configuration of how we think about how we do it in terms of structures of collaboration, what is value there, what we value. I begin to think about that a lot, given the fact that, you know, we had this moment back in the 90s where so much happened, so much was produced, I can't say so much was shown because so much was produced that wasn't shown. And I think about, artists, I mean, even moving outside of the media arts realm, I think about artists who they're no longer, people like Roland Jean and other folks. I mean, I could list a long list who aren't here. And they aren't here because the conditions for production, the conditions for not just production, it's reception, right? How do we also, in this moment, create our own publics for the works and our spaces where the works can actually be engaged with and not engaged with from the perspectives of those groups of folks who read the work, not in terms of trying to find a space of inclusion in spaces that find it very difficult to really include it, So it's about, I think, for me, creating many constellations that can exist, and that can speak back to each other.
I think, I'm stuck on this thing that you said, new values. That's a huge part of it. If I'm thinking about capitalism and how everything gets recuperated and sold and taken, I think when I imagine what it would be like to have a network of Black visual practitioners, we would be valuing each other differently. And a part of what's wrong with these structures is not only that we don't have control over the means of presentation all the time, it's that there isn't care and value in how we're treated and how we're presented, and that's what's missing. So sort of reconfiguring how we value each other, how we value the work that we make would be important. And then second, that idea of conditions of reception. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about art and then also writing about it. And what I see as important in what I'm trying to do is create a language and a vocabulary sometimes, like to draw those links together so that we can appreciate. And that has something to do with the reception, being able to put words on that fuzzy feeling you get when you see three different things and they're kind of related, but you can't quite tell. I think that's what's missing, and what I can't wait for us to have more of is a really sort of strong, healthy discourse around all of the different types of Black art that is produced, of African diasporic art that's produced in Canada. We're in the infancy phase.
We are, and I think if we're going to honor and move forward in a productive way of creating new knowledge, we must honor those who actually did the heavy lifting prior to our being here. And
like Dion Brand, Charmaine Nelson, there are so many. Yes, absolutely.
And learn from the strategies. So, there's one thing about honoring that is about celebrating the path, but I think we also have to be reflexive and critical to understand where the failures were without it becoming a negative situation. But it's about learning from, I believe, failure or not achieving a specific goal. I won't call it failure, but it could be called failure. Not achieving necessarily a specific goal and being able to be in a space as folks who grow and are intending to create knowledge in the world and see ourselves as knowledge makers, to be able to use that information so that we can actually, in the current moment and context, try to draw from those strategies so we can create ones that will help us better negotiate our present and our future.
And I think it's about becoming a community. So you were talking about creating a space where we could, own and produce and disseminate. And it's also about us recognizing not only those past, instead of failures, let's say attempts, those forays and those tries, which makes our work in the present stronger. But yeah, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of like an archipelago. I don't think that things need to be centralized, and I think the nature of Black study is almost that it is decentralized, that we're working in the cracks and from the outside, and that's, again, where that strength comes from. But what I'm seeing, even the past 3 or 5 years, is so much more Black art, so much more discussion about it, so much more writing about it, so much more presentation about it, and it seems like across the country, this stuff is happening, and we see each other. Like putting together that chroma issue with Denise Reiner, it was so exciting. Like we could only do a little bit. It's an issue that's all about African diasporic practices in Canada, and it's a fraction of all of the names that we had and the pitches and the things that we had to consider, and we had to narrow it down. And that felt, I don't know, I felt it in my stomach. It was exciting. So there is a lot there, and I am heartened by the fact that now we're beginning to see each other, that the communication technologies that are such a huge part of our life and, you know, awful in some ways, are positive in that way. We're able to connect.
I agree with you, but you know, the one thing I have to keep working through and working on is that we are communities, right? There are a number of us sort of doing different things from different perspectives. And that's the most valuable thing, is that for me is the need for all of that to happen, right? And not to be seduced, to be pulled into some sort of centralized notion and singular articulation of who we are. Because I think that becomes the problem, right? And so we ought to be able to disagree with each other. We ought to be able to support each other and to disagree with each other as a form of trying to create something different, not as a form of trying to wipe each other out to create the single exceptional Black artist or Black cultural institution, because I feel like sometimes we get seduced into that place, right? Around this thing about being exceptional and no one will exist except for one or two, or one's value becomes predicated on being in particular spaces. Things like, if you, and I have to say this, Yaniya, I know that you're part of this organization, but the sort of seduction of value around things like one has to be published in Canadian art, right? As a way to make one's career. I think we have to, at a certain point, let go of these kind of pinnacles of success, and that there are many, many, many pinnacles in the different constellations in which we exist, right? So yeah, the archipelago, but I like to just sort of like spread out with these connections that connect us, right? But we're not necessarily in the same arc, right?
And that's diasporic. Like we come from this origin and then we grow and we go everywhere. We're everywhere. That's the nature of Blackness, I think. And yeah, creating new values, seeing that differently. And I think sometimes with this, like a culture of exceptionalism, of being the first or the only, or of, yeah, getting into a certain magazine, is we lose criticality. It's just enough to be there, but then what we lose is people engaging with us and I think holding us accountable. So again, thinking of those past attempts, not necessarily failures, what we can do when we see them and we recognize them, I think is it's like care and accountability, and those are really important. And I think that will make our practices stronger, and that will make our community stronger, because we'll be looking at what's been done and trying to extend it and do it better, and I don't know, be different in how we do it and grow.
Yeah, Tanya's just pointing out to us that look at Leon Simpson's Islands of Decolonial Love, and I agree. I so agree. I just have to say one thing. My disability stops me from sitting much longer, so I need to stand up.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm going to take away, I'm thinking of new values, definitely. Conditions for reception, care and accountability. I've got a whole writing here. I'm sort of happy with our conversation so far, and I feel really like honored that you read the essay and thought about the films together. And thanks for your work. Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks for citing my work. I'd also like to say that, you know, I would like to continue our discussion, particularly around this idea of glitch and refusal as it shows up in Ariel's work. I think I have to think about that a lot more, to tell you the truth. And I might even push back at you in a certain way, but I think that's the kind of thing that I think we need to do as we grow through this stuff. And also, you know, I think that as we talk about it in my pushback, I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot that will help me think through it even deeper.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for doing the work.
Yeah. Kira, Lisa, everyone at VTape who helped us put this together. Thanks a lot as well.
Yeah, thanks VTape for doing this.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna
Bye.
figure out how to